The storm had come out of nowhere, roaring through the dense forest like a beast shaking itself awake. Rain lashed the windshield as Emily and her friends, Mark, Sarah, and Liam, drove deeper into the woods, following the cryptic directions from the cabin's website. They had rented it on a whim, remote, cozy, perfect for disconnecting. It seemed like a dream getaway, a chance to escape their daily grind. But now, with the wind howling and the trees looming like sinister sentinels, the decision seemed less like an escape and more like a trap. When they arrived, the cabin looked as advertised, rustic, small, and tucked between towering pines. The lights flickered as they unloaded the car, but Emily brushed it off. "Storm's messing with the power," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. The others didn't seem to notice. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old earth. A heavy, oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the wind bending the walls. As the group settled in, a sense of foreboding crept into Emily's mind. She couldn't place it. Something about the way the shadows pooled in the corners, the uneven scratching sounds that seemed to come from under the floorboards. Still, she laughed it off when Liam teased her about being paranoid. After dinner, they found an old guest book on the dusty mantel. They passed it around, laughing at the amateur poetry and scribbled complaints about mosquitoes. But as Emily flipped through the pages, her hand froze. One entry stood out: "Do not stay here. It wants you alone." The ink was smeared, the writing frantic, as if the person had been trembling when they wrote it. Emily showed the others, but Mark waved it off. Probably some bored kid trying to freak people out. That night, the wind intensified. The shutters rattled so violently it sounded like they might break loose. Emily woke to the sound of something scratching at the window. Her heart pounded as she sat up, straining to see through the rain-blurred glass. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Then a flash of lightning lit the yard, and there was nothing. In the morning, Sarah noticed deep gouges in the wooden frame of the front door. "Bear?" she suggested, but the claw marks didn't match anything Emily had ever seen. They looked deliberate, like something or someone had been trying to get in. The second night, the air inside the cabin felt heavy, suffocating. Emily woke again, this time to a whisper. She couldn't make out the words, but it was close. Far too close. Her breath caught as she turned her head toward the sound. There, at the foot of her bed, stood a figure. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its outline was unmistakable. A tall, gaunt shape with elongated arms that seemed to twitch unnaturally. Emily wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure tilted its head, and then it was gone. The others found her shaking in the corner of the room, too terrified to explain what she had seen. Sarah suggested leaving immediately, but the storm had washed out the road. They were trapped, and as the hours dragged on, the unease deepened. Every sound, the groaning of the floorboards, the rattling of the windows, felt deliberate, as if the cabin itself was alive. By the third night, Mark disappeared. One moment he was sitting by the fireplace, drinking a beer and trying to lighten the mood. The next, he was gone. No sound, no sign of struggle, just his empty chair and the faint smell of something metallic in the air. They searched the cabin, the yard, the surrounding woods, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Panic set in. Liam tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Even the old landline in the cabin was dead, though Sarah swore she had heard it ringing faintly just hours before. That night, Sarah was the next to go. Emily woke to the sound of her screaming. She and Liam ran to Sarah's room, only to find the door locked from the inside. When they finally broke it down, the room was empty. The window was open, rain pouring in, and on the wall, scrawled in a dark, viscous substance, was a single word: mine. Emily and Liam decided to stay awake together, huddled in the living room with the fire burning low. But exhaustion took its toll. Emily must have dozed off because when she opened her eyes, Liam was gone. The fire had gone out and the cabin was plunged into darkness. The silence was deafening. She called for him, her voice trembling, but only the echo of her own words answered. Then came the whispers again, closer this time, circling her like a predator stalking its prey. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light of her flashlight. The walls seemed to close in, the cabin groaning as if alive. When she turned back toward the door, it was standing there. The figure, taller now, its limbs impossibly long, its head tilted in that same unnerving way. This time, Emily didn't freeze. She ran, throwing open the front door and sprinting into the storm. She didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the whispers turned into guttural growls that seemed to chase her through the trees. She stumbled into the nearest town at dawn, soaked, hysterical, and alone. The locals didn't believe her story, dismissing it as a bad trip or a nervous breakdown. When she insisted they investigate the cabin, they only exchanged uneasy glances. "There's no cabin up there," one old man finally said. "Burned down years ago. Fire took the whole thing along with a family. Only thing left is ash and bones." But Emily knew better. The cabin was there, waiting for its next guests, and whatever it was that lived inside it, it wasn't done yet. It was an old tradition among the locals. No one stayed on Black Hollow Ridge past sundown. The abandoned cabin there was the source of countless ghost stories and superstitions, but most dismissed them as nonsense. Yet every year, a dare would circulate among teenagers, challenging the bravest to spend just one night in the cabin. Most didn't make it until morning, when 5 college friends, Katie, Drew, Melissa, Jordan, and Sam, heard about the challenge during their weekend getaway in the nearby town. They laughed it off. "It's just a creaky shack," Sam scoffed. "Let's prove these hicks wrong and stay the whole night. Think of the photos we'll get." The road to Black Hollow Ridge was a twisting dirt path bordered by skeletal trees that seemed to claw at the night sky. The locals had tried to block access with a rusted gate, but Drew easily climbed over and helped the others. The cabin loomed ahead, rotting and crooked, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Windows, long shattered, gaped like black, empty eyes. The air smelled of wet moss and decay. "Okay, this is definitely haunted," Melissa joked, snapping a picture on her phone. She didn't notice the faint movement in the corner of the frame, a shadow darker than the night itself. Inside, the cabin was worse. The walls were scrawled with strange symbols that looked burned into the wood. A jagged hole gaped in the center of the floor, its depths swallowing their flashlight beams. Katie shivered, feeling as though the cabin itself was breathing, its wooden boards creaking in unnatural rhythms. "Anyone else hear that?" she whispered. The others brushed it off. Drew lit a fire in the dusty stone hearth while Sam set up a Bluetooth speaker, blasting music to lighten the mood. The sound echoed eerily in the small space, amplifying every creak and groan of the structure. Jordan stepped outside to smoke, muttering something about the stench inside making him sick. An hour passed, then 2. Katie began to relax, convincing herself that the creepy vibes were just her imagination. But when Jordan didn't come back, the tension returned. "Where's he gone?" she asked. Drew checked his watch. "He's been gone a while. Let's check." They found his cigarette still burning on the porch, its ember glowing faintly in the damp air. But Jordan was nowhere in sight. Melissa called his name, her voice trembling, but the only reply was the wind rustling the trees. It carried a faint whisper, so soft and chilling it made her skin crawl. Katie turned to head back inside and froze. There, in the broken window of the cabin, a pale face was watching them. Its features were distorted, hollow eyes too wide, mouth stretched in a silent scream. When she gasped and pointed, it was gone. The group panicked, huddling together in the main room. Sam locked the door with a rusted latch, though it seemed laughable to think the flimsy wood would keep anything out. "It's a prank," he said, though his voice shook. "Someone's trying to scare us." The whispers grew louder, no longer carried by the wind, but emanating from the cabin itself. Katie realized they weren't random. The voices were calling her name. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. They were inside her head now, a cacophony of pleading, anger, and despair. Melissa was the next to disappear. One moment she was pacing near the hole in the floor, and the next, she was gone. Katie turned just in time to see her being dragged down, her mouth open in a silent scream, her fingernails clawing at the wooden boards. Drew lunged to grab her, but something pulled her out of sight, vanishing into the blackness below. The hole yawned wider. "Out! We have to get out!" Katie screamed, dragging Drew and Sam toward the door. But when they wrenched it open, the forest outside wasn't the same. The path they'd come up was gone, replaced by endless trees that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The cabin no longer had a porch. It was surrounded by thick, impenetrable woods. "This isn't real," Sam muttered, gripping his head. "This isn't." The lights flickered and died, plunging the cabin into total darkness. The fire in the hearth extinguished itself, leaving only the oppressive void. Drew fumbled with his flashlight, the beam weak and sputtering. In its faint glow, Katie saw them, shadows moving, curling around the walls, each one shaped like a person but grotesquely elongated, their limbs dragging, heads twitching unnaturally. "They're all around us," Katie whispered. She could barely breathe. Her chest felt like it was caving in. The shadows drew closer, their forms solidifying. She recognized one of them, Melissa, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes black pits. Another was Jordan, his neck bent at an unnatural angle, lips moving soundlessly. Sam bolted for the hole, leaping into the blackness rather than face the shadows. His scream echoed, then abruptly cut off. The cabin groaned as if alive, the walls flexing inward. Drew grabbed Katie's arm, dragging her toward the back door. "There's gotta be another way out," he shouted, but the door wasn't there anymore. Just solid, rotting wood. The last thing Katie saw was Drew being wrenched from her side by invisible hands. He was screaming, clawing at the air, but there was nothing to fight. The shadows consumed him, and she was alone. The whispers grew deafening, her name echoing from every corner. She pressed herself against the wall, shaking, tears streaming down her face. The cabin began to collapse around her, the walls caving in, the floor splitting open. And then, just as the darkness swallowed her whole, she heard it. A low, guttural voice, speaking from the abyss. "You belong to us now." When search teams found the cabin weeks later, it was empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Just a single symbol carved into the wood, an ancient rune that no one could identify. Locals swore it hadn't been there before. And when a new group of teenagers dared to stay there months later, they found the same symbol burned into their skin. The train ride was supposed to be uneventful. Rachel had taken the midnight express from the city to visit her family in a small town across the state. She liked the quiet hum of the train at night, the darkness outside making the cabin feel safe and cocooned. She had her earbuds in, a paperback novel open on her lap, and only a handful of other passengers shared the dimly lit carriage. It was near 1:30 a.m. when the train slowed unexpectedly. Rachel looked up, confused. There wasn't a station nearby, just dense forest stretching endlessly on either side. The train came to a full stop, the lights flickering for a moment before stabilizing. A soft murmur of confusion rippled through the passengers, but no one seemed alarmed. A conductor appeared from the front of the car, his hat pulled low over his face. His uniform looked off, faded and threadbare, as if it hadn't been updated in decades. He didn't make eye contact as he moved down the aisle, his voice monotone. "Everyone stay seated. We'll be moving shortly." Rachel tried to shrug it off, but something about the way he moved, rigid and unnatural, like a marionette on strings, put her on edge. She glanced around the carriage. Most of the other passengers had returned to their own distractions, but the woman across the aisle from Rachel wasn't so composed. She sat stiffly, clutching a small suitcase to her chest, her eyes darting toward the windows. "What's going on?" Rachel asked softly. The woman didn't look at her, but whispered, barely audible, "Don't look outside." Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" "Just don't," the woman hissed. Her knuckles were white against the handle of her suitcase. "It notices when you look." Before Rachel could ask what she meant, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back fully. The train was bathed in a sickly yellow glow, barely enough to see by. Rachel's phone buzzed with a weather alert, something about severe storms in the area. But when she looked at the window, there was no rain, just the endless, suffocating darkness pressing against the glass. She couldn't help herself. She looked. At first, she thought she was seeing her reflection. But the longer she stared, the more the figure outside became distinct. It wasn't her reflection. It was a man, or at least something shaped like a man. His limbs were too long, his torso impossibly narrow. His face was pale and flat, devoid of features except for two deep-set black eyes. He stood just beyond the tree line, staring at the train. Rachel blinked, and he was gone. Her heart hammered in her chest. She looked back at the woman, who now had tears streaming down her face. "You looked, didn't you?" the woman whispered. I thought I saw," Rachel began, but the woman cut her off. "You can't unsee it now. It knows you saw." Rachel's stomach twisted. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss the woman as crazy, but her trembling hands made it hard to hold on to her book. She glanced around again. The other passengers seemed oblivious, though their faces looked oddly vacant. One man stared straight ahead, unblinking, his lips moving as if repeating something silently. A child near the back had her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth. Then the train began moving again, slowly at first. The motion did little to calm Rachel's nerves. She clutched her phone, scrolling through her messages as if the act of texting someone might anchor her in reality. The screen refused to load. No signal. A voice crackled over the intercom, distorted and faint like a recording played on a warped tape. "Thank you for riding with us. Next stop, Ender's Hollow." Rachel frowned. That wasn't the name of her stop. She was sure of it. She looked up, about to ask someone, when she realized the woman across from her was gone. Her seat was empty, the suitcase left behind. "Excuse me," Rachel said aloud, her voice shaky. "Did anyone see where she went?" No one answered. It was as if they hadn't heard her. The man who had been staring straight ahead now turned to look at her, his head moving slowly, too deliberately. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. His lips curled into a slight smile. "You shouldn't have looked," he said. Rachel bolted out of her seat, her breathing ragged. She moved to the next car, her steps hurried, but the next carriage was empty, completely empty. No seats, no lights, just an endless corridor stretching farther than the train could logically be. Her pulse thundered as she stepped back into her original car. But now it wasn't the same. The passengers were still there, but their faces were wrong, stretched and distorted, their mouths pulled into inhumanly wide grins. The child in the back no longer covered her ears. Instead, she stared directly at Rachel, her eyes black voids. Rachel stumbled backward, colliding with a figure. She spun around to see the conductor standing behind her. His face was gone, replaced with a blank, featureless surface. He raised an arm impossibly long and pointed toward the window. "Look," he said. Rachel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She squeezed her eyes shut, but she could feel something pressing against the glass, something waiting for her attention. "Look," the conductor repeated, his voice echoing in her skull. Her resolve broke. She turned. Outside, the pale figure stood inches from the glass now. Its black eyes met hers, and it smiled. Its mouth stretched wide, splitting its face, rows of jagged teeth gleaming in the faint light. The train lurched to a stop, and the doors hissed open. Rachel didn't scream. She couldn't. The figure stepped onto the train, its footsteps echoing down the aisle as it moved toward her. The next morning, the train pulled into its final destination, empty. The passengers were gone, their belongings neatly arranged in their seats. Rachel's phone was found on the floor, a single text drafted but unsent. "Don't look." No one ever spoke of the Midnight Express again. Those who knew its route avoided it, and those who dared to ride, they were never seen again. The house was a legend in the small town of Ravenwood. Everyone called it the Widow's Veil, named after the dense, mist-like ivy that covered its crumbling facade. Perched at the edge of a desolate cliff, the mansion was an enduring reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there decades ago. A family of 5 had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of occult rituals and shadowy figures in the windows. Over the years, it had become a dare among teenagers. Spend one night in the Widow's Veil and you'd prove you were fearless. Amy and her friends, Max, Lena, and Jay, thought it was just a creepy old house. Nothing more. They arrived at dusk, the sky bruised with storm clouds. The air felt heavier as they approached, the silence almost physical. The front gate hung loosely on its hinges, groaning as they pushed it open. The house smelled of rot and mildew, its floorboards warped and soft underfoot. The grand staircase in the center of the entryway loomed like a skeletal spine disappearing into the darkness above. They unpacked their gear, flashlights, snacks, a Bluetooth speaker, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere. "Piece of cake," Max said, forcing a laugh. His bravado faltered when a door upstairs slammed, the sound reverberating through the hollow space. "Probably the wind," he muttered. "Wind doesn't slam doors," Lena said, her voice tight. Still, they stayed. The first few hours passed uneventfully, though the house seemed to breathe around them. Shadows shifted in ways that defied the flickering flashlight beams, and faint sounds like distant whispers came from the walls. Amy kept telling herself it was just her imagination. At midnight, Jay dared them to explore the second floor. They climbed the staircase cautiously, their footsteps loud against the brittle wood. The hallway stretched before them, lined with doorways that yawned open like black mouths. Amy's heart raced as she glanced into the rooms. Each one was empty, save for the thick layers of dust and the occasional piece of broken furniture. "Guys," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you feel that?" Amy did. The air had changed. It was colder now, and the smell of decay was stronger. She shined her flashlight down the hall and froze. A figure stood at the far end, partially obscured by the shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted as if observing them. "Who's there?" Max called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Amy took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The figure twitched just slightly and began walking toward them. "Run!" Lena screamed. They bolted down the stairs, their panic clumsy and chaotic. Amy tripped and, catching herself on the banister and looked back, the figure was gone. But the house felt alive now, the walls vibrating faintly as if they were breathing. "We need to leave," Amy gasped when they reached the foyer. "The front door," Jay started, but when he yanked it open, the world outside was wrong. The night sky was gone, replaced by swirling, suffocating blackness. It pressed against the threshold, as if the house had been cut off from the rest of reality. "We're trapped," Lena whispered, her eyes wide. Suddenly, the chandelier above them flickered to life, casting a pale, sickly light. The sound of footsteps echoed above, slow and deliberate. They looked up to see the figure descending the staircase, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. Its face was obscured by the same ivy that covered the house, twisting and writhing like living veins. Max grabbed a chair and hurled it at the figure. The chair passed through it as though it were made of smoke, shattering against the stairs. The figure didn't stop. "This way!" Amy shouted, dragging them toward a door near the back of the foyer. They stumbled into what had once been a dining room. The long table was still set, but the plates were filled with blackened, rotting food. The chairs around the table were occupied by figures slumped forward, their skeletal hands gripping the tablecloth. "Don't look," Amy whispered, but it was too late. The seated figures began to twitch, their heads jerking upright. Empty eye sockets turned toward the group, their mouths opening in silent screams. The lights flickered, and the room changed. The walls warped, the ceiling stretching impossibly high. The figures at the table stood, their bony hands reaching out. Jay screamed as one of them grabbed his wrist, its grip impossibly strong. The others tried to pull him free, but the skeletal figure opened its mouth and exhaled a cloud of dark mist. Jay's screams turned into choking gasps as his skin turned pale, his eyes rolling back. "Run!" Amy yelled again, pulling Lena and Max away. They fled down a hallway that seemed to twist endlessly. The sound of footsteps, too many footsteps, followed them, echoing and overlapping as if an army were chasing them. Doors appeared and disappeared along the walls, each one opening to reveal horrors worse than the last. A room filled with dangling nooses that swayed on their own, a mirror that reflected their terrified faces but nothing else, a staircase that spiraled downward into a pit of writhing shadows. The house was playing with them. Finally, they burst into a small room that seemed normal. The walls were bare, and a single window let in moonlight. The outside world looked real again. Amy ran to the window, but as she reached out to open it, her hand passed through the glass like it wasn't there. "This can't be happening," Max said, sinking to his knees. "This isn't real." The door slammed shut behind them, and the room grew colder. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, pooling together in the center of the room. Slowly, the shadows rose, forming a shape that towered over them. The ivy-covered figure was back, its empty face inches from Amy's. It whispered, though no sound came from its unmoving mouth. "You came uninvited. You cannot leave." The lights flickered once more, and everything went black. When the sun rose the next morning, the widow's veil was as silent and still as ever. The locals noticed the teenager's car parked near the gate, but didn't dare investigate. No one entered the house again. Years later, some hikers claimed to see figures standing in the upstairs windows. Others said they could hear faint screams when the wind blew just right. The legend continued, and the house waited. It started as a rumor, something whispered among coworkers on slow days at the office. The elevator to nowhere. People claimed that in certain old buildings you could accidentally step into an elevator that wasn't supposed to exist. It looked normal enough. Numbered buttons, polished walls, a faint hum of machinery. But once the doors closed, you'd find yourself in a ride that didn't stop where it should. And if you were unlucky, it wouldn't let you off at all. Samantha didn't believe in urban legends. She worked late shifts in a sprawling office tower downtown, and the elevator was her lifeline. Her desk was on the 23rd floor, and walking the stairs after a 12-hour shift wasn't an option. It was 11:47 p.m. when she finally packed up her things. She was the last to leave, as usual, the empty office buzzing with the hum of fluorescent lights. The building was eerily quiet, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. When the elevator dinged and the doors slid open, Samantha didn't think twice before stepping in. She hit the button for the lobby and leaned against the back wall, rubbing her tired eyes. The ride began as normal, smooth, uneventful. The numbers above the door ticked downward, 23, 22, 21. But then the elevator shuddered slightly and the lights flickered. Samantha frowned, stepping forward. The panel now displayed only a single button, a blank, black circle with no number or label. "What the hell?" she muttered, pressing it out of reflex. The elevator lurched downward, faster now, the hum of the machinery deepening into a low, unsettling groan. Samantha gripped the handrail, her heart pounding. The ride felt endless. The air grew colder and the fluorescent lights above her dimmed to a faint, sickly yellow. Finally, the elevator jolted to a stop and the doors slid open with a hiss. She stepped out into nothing. The hallway before her was gray and featureless, stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls were bare concrete, the floor a dull metal that echoed under her shoes. A faint, pulsating hum came from somewhere distant, like the building itself was alive. "Hello?" Samantha called, her voice small and uncertain. It was swallowed by the oppressive silence. She turned to get back in the elevator, but the doors were gone. The metal wall was smooth and unbroken, as if the elevator had never existed. "Okay," she whispered, her breath hitching. "This isn't real. This is a stress dream or something." She started walking, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the emptiness. The corridor seemed endless, the fluorescent lights above flickering sporadically. She tried to use her phone, but there was no signal, no Wi-Fi, no data, not even the time displayed. Just a blank, glowing screen. Then she heard it. Faint, dragging footsteps behind her. She froze, her blood turning cold. "Hello?" she called again, her voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps stopped. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The corridor behind her was empty. "Get it together, Sam," she whispered to herself, walking faster now. The footsteps resumed, matching her pace. No, they weren't matching, they were getting closer. She broke into a run, her breath ragged. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long. She turned a corner, then another, her sense of direction unraveling. The footsteps behind her were louder now, heavier, accompanied by a sound like wet fabric dragging across the floor. Her flashlight beam caught something ahead. A figure stood at the end of the hall, its back to her. It was unnaturally tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its arms hung too long at its sides, the fingers brushing the floor. "Hey!" she shouted, desperate for some kind of answer, even from this thing. The figure turned, its face a featureless void except for a mouth that stretched into a jagged, gaping smile. The lights flickered, and it was gone. Samantha spun around, heart racing, only to see the figure now behind her. It was closer, too close. The stench of decay filled the air. Its long, spindly hand reached out, the fingers curling toward her. She screamed and bolted down another hallway. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, but the corridors never ended. She could hear it behind her, its footsteps impossibly loud now, its ragged breathing filling the space. And then she saw it, a door at the end of the hallway. A plain metal door, slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. Samantha ran harder, throwing herself toward it. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare hesitate. She burst through the door and slammed it shut behind her. She found herself back in the elevator, the normal elevator. The numbers above the door were ticking down. 3, 2, 1. The lobby. The doors slid open with a cheerful ding. The bright, bustling lobby was a stark contrast to the nightmare she had just escaped. People milled about, chatting and laughing, completely unaware of what had just happened. Samantha staggered out, her legs trembling, her breath still ragged. She turned to look back at the elevator. The doors were closing, but before they shut completely, she saw it, the same tall, grinning figure standing inside, watching her. She didn't take the elevator again, not in that building, not anywhere. And every night she dreamed of endless hallways and dragging footsteps that always seemed just a little too close. There was a road on the outskirts of town that everyone avoided at night. Black Hollow Lane, they called it. though no one remembered why. It cut through a dense, suffocating forest, the kind where the trees grew so thick their gnarled branches formed a canopy, blocking out the moonlight. Over the years, there had been stories about cars breaking down, about people disappearing, about things seen in the rearview mirror that shouldn't have been there. Jenna didn't believe in ghost stories. She'd heard them all growing up, the warnings her parents gave her, the hushed tales her friends shared around campfires. It was just a road, she thought. A stretch of asphalt that looked creepier than most, sure, but still just a road. So when her GPS redirected her down Black Hollow Lane one late October night, she didn't hesitate. She was in a hurry to get home after visiting her sister in the next town over. The faster route shaved off 20 minutes, and that was all that mattered. The forest swallowed her car as she turned onto the lane. The headlights cut through the dense darkness, illuminating the road but little else. The trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky. The hum of her tires on the uneven pavement was the only sound, her radio cutting in and out with bursts of static. A fog rolled in, thick and sudden. Jenna slowed the car, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. Her high beams barely pierced the gray wall that enveloped her. The GPS lost its connection, the map freezing on her screen. "Great," she muttered, glancing at her phone. No signal. She turned up the music to drown out the growing unease in her chest. Then something darted across the road. Jenna slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. Her car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the pavement. She sat there, gripping the wheel, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. She squinted into the fog, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of whatever had crossed. It had been fast, low to the ground, too big to be a raccoon, too small to be a deer. Maybe a coyote? She shook her head and pressed the gas pedal, but the car didn't move. The engine revved, but the wheels refused to turn. She groaned, throwing it into park and stepping out to check. The air outside was icy cold, the kind of chill that sank into her bones. The fog pressed close, muffling every sound. She walked to the front of the car, her boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. Her breath caught. Long, deep scratches marred the hood of her car, as if some massive clawed animal had raked across it. The metal was gouged, the paint peeling away. "What the?" she began, but a sound behind her cut her off. It was faint at first, a soft rustling like leaves being disturbed. Then came the whispering. Low and guttural, too many voices speaking at once. Jenna spun around, her heart hammering. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The fog seemed thicker now, the darkness pressing closer. She backed toward her car, scanning the trees for movement. That's when she saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Glowing faintly in the dark, yellow and unblinking. They were set deep in the fog, just beyond the edge of the light, watching her. Jenna's breath hitched. She fumbled for the door handle, her shaking fingers barely gripping it. She threw herself inside and locked the doors. Her chest heaved as she tried to calm her breathing, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out her thoughts. The eyes didn't move, but the whispers returned, louder now. They seemed to come from everywhere. Outside the car, inside her head. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. "Stop it," she screamed. The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Her phone buzzed suddenly, making her jump. She grabbed it, her trembling hands almost dropping it. The screen was blank, save for a single text message. "Run." Her scream caught in her throat as something slammed against the side of the car. The impact rocked the vehicle, leaving a massive dent in the passenger side door. Another blow came, this time from the roof. The car groaned under the weight of something heavy dragging across it. Jenna didn't think. She turned the key, and to her relief, the engine roared to life. She slammed the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car jolted forward. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the fog thickening, the trees bending unnaturally, as if trying to reach for her. She kept her eyes on the road by ignoring the shadows flickering in the corner of her vision, ignoring the whispers that grew louder and more frantic. Then she saw it in the rearview mirror. A figure was chasing her. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and distorted, its face obscured by the fog. It moved unnaturally fast, its gangly frame twisting and jerking as it closed the distance. "No, no, no," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She floored the gas pedal, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. The figure was still there, keeping pace effortlessly. Its long, spindly hand reached out, its claws scraping against the trunk of her car. Suddenly, the fog lifted. The forest gave way to an open road, the pale glow of the moon lighting her path. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. Jenna didn't stop driving until she reached the lights of her town. She pulled into a gas station and stumbled out of the car, her legs shaking. Her car was covered in deep gouges, the roof dented inward. But what chilled her the most was the message scrawled across the windshield, written in deep, jagged scratches. "You can't escape." Jenna sold her car the next day. She moved to the city a week later. But sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear the whispers again. And every now and then, when she checked her rearview mirror, she thought she saw eyes watching her from the darkness. The town of Hollow Creek had one rule whispered among its residents: never, under any circumstances, go near the old well in the woods after sunset. Nobody explained why, and nobody dared to break the rule. The well had stood there for centuries, its moss-covered stones sinking into the earth as if trying to bury themselves. For Grace, new to the town and skeptical of folklore, the warning was nothing more than small-town superstition. She'd moved in with her grandmother after losing her job and had grown tired of the eerie stories that everyone seemed to take so seriously. One night, while walking home from a friend's house, Grace found herself drawn to the edge of the woods. The moon hung low, casting pale light through the skeletal branches. She hesitated, but felt a strange pull. She'd passed these woods dozens of times, but tonight was different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an electric hum that made her skin tingle. Curiosity won over caution. She stepped off the gravel road and onto the forest path, her boots crunching against the frost-covered leaves. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became, as though the trees were swallowing the sound. Finally she saw it, the well. It stood in a small clearing, surrounded by dead, twisted trees. The stone looked darker than it should in the moonlight, almost black, and the air around it seemed colder. A wooden bucket dangled from a frayed rope, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. Grace approached cautiously, her breath visible in the icy air. She peered over the edge, half expecting to see nothing but darkness. But the well wasn't empty. A faint, silvery light shimmered from its depths, like moonlight reflected on water. "Beautiful," she murmured, leaning closer. A sound made her freeze, a faint splash, like something moving far below. Then came the whispering. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but as it grew louder, the words became harsh, guttural, incomprehensible. She stumbled back, her pulse racing. The bucket began to rise on its own, the rope creaking as it slowly climbed. Grace watched, paralyzed, as the bucket reached the top and tipped forward. Instead of water, thick, black liquid poured out, spilling onto the ground. The liquid moved unnaturally, pooling and then crawling like it had a mind of its own. She turned to run, but froze when she heard her name. Grace. The voice was low, raspy, and unmistakably familiar. Her mother's voice. Her mother, who had died 2 years ago. "Mom?" she whispered, her heart pounding. "Grace, help me," the voice pleaded. It came from the well. Tears welled in her eyes. She knew it wasn't possible, but the voice, it was exactly right. Every nuance, every inflection. She took a hesitant step closer. "Please, Grace," the voice said again, breaking into a sob. "I'm trapped." Her rational mind screamed at her to run, but the pull was overwhelming. She leaned over the edge, staring into the shimmering light. A hand shot out of the darkness, pale and skeletal, its fingers impossibly long. It grabbed her wrist with a vice-like grip and pulled. She screamed, clawing at the stone rim, but the strength of the thing was inhuman. The whispers turned into deafening shrieks, the well vibrating with the sound. Grace's nails scraped against the stone as she was dragged closer, her legs kicking wildly. The light in the well grew brighter, almost blinding, but beneath it, she could see them, faces. Dozens of them, twisted, hollow-eyed, their mouths open in silent screams. She mustered all her strength and kicked hard against the edge of the well. The thing's grip loosened just enough for her to yank her arm free. She stumbled back, falling onto the frozen ground. The shrieking stopped instantly. The well was silent, the light gone. The bucket hung still as if nothing had happened. Grace scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't stop until she was back home, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. The next morning, she told her grandmother what had happened. The old woman's face went pale, her hands trembling. "You went to the well?" her grandmother whispered. Do you understand what you've done? Grace shook her head, tears in her eyes. I didn't know. I thought it was her. I thought it was Mom. Her grandmother grabbed her hands, her grip surprisingly strong. It wasn't your mother. The well shows you what you want to see, what you want to hear. It knows your pain, your secrets. It feeds on them. Grace didn't sleep that night, or the next. She stayed inside after dark, avoiding the woods altogether. But the whispers followed her. Late at night, she'd hear her name, faint and distant, coming from outside her window. When she closed her eyes, she'd see the faces from the well, their hollow eyes staring back at her. One night, the whispers grew louder, closer. She woke to find her bedroom window open, the icy wind blowing through. On the floor was a trail of black liquid leading to her bed. And in the silence that followed, she heard it again, clear and unmistakable. Grace, help me. She never saw the morning. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere. One moment, Mark was driving down a quiet rural highway, his favorite playlist keeping him company. The next, he was caught in a blinding whiteout, the wind howling like a wild beast. His phone had no signal, the battery threatening to die any moment. He squinted through the windshield, trying to find anything resembling a road sign or an exit. That's when he saw the cabin. It was small, nestled at the edge of a frozen forest, its single window glowing faintly with the flicker of a fire. Relief washed over him. Shelter. A place to wait out the storm. He parked his car on the snowy shoulder and trudged through the knee-deep drifts, his breath clouding the air. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, swaying gently on its hinges. "Hello?" Mark called, stepping inside. The warmth hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the freezing cold outside. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The cabin was sparse but cozy. A small table, a rocking chair, a bed in the corner. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as though it hadn't been touched in years. "Anyone here?" He tried again, louder this time. No answer. But the fire seemed too fresh, too alive to have been left unattended for long. He closed the door against the storm, deciding it was better to stay here than risk freezing to death in his car. He'd leave at first light. Mark sat in the rocking chair, stretching out his hands toward the fire. The warmth seeped into his bones, melting away the chill. The storm outside raged on, the wind hammering against the cabin walls. That's when he noticed the photographs. They were on the mantel above the fireplace. 3 black and white images in simple wooden frames. The first showed a man, his face stern, wearing an old-fashioned suit. The second was a woman in a long dress, her eyes sharp and intense. The third was a little boy, no older than 6, staring directly at the camera. Mark felt a chill, but not from the cold. The boy's expression was wrong. His eyes were too wide, his mouth slightly parted as if caught mid-scream. He looked away, uneasy, and noticed something else, a 4th frame, face down on the mantel. Mark hesitated, then reached for it. The wood was cold and rough under his fingers. He turned it over. It was another photo, this one blurred and discolored, but the image was clear enough. It showed the same little boy, but now he was outside, standing in front of the cabin. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Suddenly, the fire sputtered. The warm light dimmed, the shadows growing longer and darker. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. Mark turned, his pulse quickening. The rocking chair, it was moving, rocking gently back and forth, though he wasn't sitting in it anymore. "Hello?" he said, his voice cracking. The only answer was the wind screaming against the windows. Mark stood, his eyes darting around the room. Something was wrong. He could feel it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, watching him. He moved toward the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if it had frozen solid. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. They overlapped, a chorus of murmurs and cries, their words incomprehensible. Mark stumbled backward, his heart racing. The shadows on the walls began to move, writhing and twisting, forming shapes that didn't belong to anything human. "Stop!" he shouted, clutching his head. "Stop it!" The room fell silent. He opened his eyes, and there, standing in front of the fireplace, was the boy from the photographs. Mark froze. The boy's skin was deathly pale, his eyes black pits that seemed to absorb the light. His mouth curled into that same unnatural grin, wide and grotesque. "Who are you?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. The boy tilted his head as if considering the question. Then he pointed to the mantel. Mark turned slowly. The fourth photo was no longer of the boy. It was of him. Mark's blood ran cold. The photo showed him sitting in the rocking chair, staring into the fire, his expression blank and lifeless. He whipped back around, but the boy was gone. The fire in the hearth roared to life, flames leaping high and wild, casting the room in a hellish glow. The shadows on the walls writhed again, forming monstrous shapes that seemed to crawl toward him. Mark screamed, lunging for the door. This time, the handle turned, and he burst out into the storm. The freezing wind cut through him as he stumbled toward his car. When he looked back, the cabin was dark. The firelight was gone, and the door hung open, swaying in the wind. Mark didn't stop driving until he was miles away, the storm finally easing. He pulled over to catch his breath, his hands trembling on the wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and his heart stopped. In the back seat, just for a moment, he saw the boy, grinning at him. Mark never went near those woods again, but sometimes, in the dead of night, he'd wake up to the sound of a rocking chair creaking and faint whispers calling his name.